I'm no good at taking good advice, and I'm self-careless, so don't tell me twice that lately I've been so stuck in my head that I forget just about everything my therapist said. Maybe I'm self-helpless. Maybe I'm self-helpless. Maybe I'm self-helpless. Maybe we are all self-helpless.
Hey everyone, welcome to Self-Helpless. I'm Delanie Fischer, and today I'm chatting with Dr. Samantha Harte, who is the author of Breaking the Circuit: How to Rewire Your Mind for Hope, Resilience, and Joy in the Face of Trauma. And in this book, Dr. Harte has reimagined and modernized the 12 steps so that they're applicable to addicts and non-addicts alike. So during this episode, we discussed Dr. Harte's experience with perfectionism, addiction, and recovery, including what she described as her experience being a classic high functioning addict. She was achieving a lot of external things, even though she was struggling with addiction. So, for example, on the same day she was accepted into a postdoctoral program, again, very high achiever. So, same day she was accepted in that program, she also overdosed on cocaine. So, that's the kind of dynamic that was going on for her. She also mentioned what it was about the 12 steps that didn't resonate with her and the approach that she and her sponsor at the time took instead to the 12 steps. She also shared about hitting her rock bottom, which she said was actually 5 years into sobriety. You often hear about somebody's rock bottom being at the height of their addiction, so that was really interesting. And Dr. Harte was also very honest about the ways that she hurt people when she was in active addiction, including her now husband, and how he responded to that hurt at the time. She really opened up a lot about their relationship through the years, including what they've done to rebuild their relationship so they could start fresh with each other and have children, and how the new versions of them respond to conflict versus what past versions of themselves would have done. I thought this was an especially important part of the conversation because the messaging that we hear around romantic relationships and unhealthy dynamics in a relationship, it's a lot of, messaging around, leave that person so you can be with a healthy person somewhere else, or, you can be healthy with somebody else. And by the way, in many cases, that is true. Nobody should stay in something where they're being mistreated. There are some dynamics where no amount of hope or therapy can change the dynamic, and all you can do is get the heck out of there. But the other side of that is, we all have shit to work on. And if both people need to change and heal and they're willing to do so, and they stay together after they've experienced an unhealthy dynamic together, in Dr. Hart's case, it was for several years, what is that experience like? Because if you keep looking externally for people to help you feel fixed or happy, or somebody to hand you the perfect relationship on a platter, you might not get a chance to heal your own stuff if you just keep jumping from person to person. So she shares how her and her husband started a new relationship with one another, even though they hurt each other a lot in the past. So I think this is just a piece we don't hear about a whole lot, is that you can have a brand new healthy relationship with the same person that you used to have a toxic dynamic with. P.S. I give an important shout out to one of our listeners and someone who was a guest on our subscriber stories series at the end of the episode, and I share something about myself that I have not shared yet on the podcast. So if you're curious, feel free to stick around for that in the outro. All right, everybody, here's my conversation with Dr. Samantha Harte. What's your personal experience been with addiction and recovery, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah. I was a classic high functioning addict. And I, in some ways, think that's the most dangerous kind because you have so many places in your life where you can check off boxes that everything is fine,
Right.
especially if you've been conditioned, which to some extent we all are in the culture we're raised in, that success means the degree, the job, the boyfriend, being able to pay your bills. And even at the end of my addiction, which ultimately was to drugs and alcohol, cocaine being the thing that took me to my knees the fastest, I still had so many of those external things. And I was raised to believe that pleasing and performing and perfecting were going to keep me safe and whole. And so long as I was still able to do that, it didn't really matter on a soul level that I had a little drinking and drugging problem. It
Mm,
scared the death out of me because as somebody who was deeply addicted to feeling in control, I was really aware that I was losing control, but just of that one thing,
mm.
even though it could kill me,
Right.
just that one thing, you know? And I think that's the really elusive part about addiction is that there is a level of spiritual bankruptcy that is required to go, I can no longer live this way. Mostly because I'm in so much pain and I've tried absolutely everything that I know that I learned that kept me safe when I was younger to get through this big problem, and it isn't working. And I don't want to die, but I don't know how to live. And for me, that bottom moment really didn't happen until 5 years into sobriety.
Oh, really? Into sobriety. That's very interesting and not what you usually hear about. Would you mind expanding on that moment? And then, of course, I have a million questions for you in other directions, but that's
Oh, yeah.
fascinating.
So when I got sober, the year before I really started going to meetings, I overdosed on cocaine the same day that I got accepted into a doctoral program. Okay. So that
Um,
really captures the level at which I was still performing
Jeez.
and the way in which I needed to celebrate for all my hard work. And that got me so spooked that I went to a meeting with the one person I knew who was sober. And I sat in the back of those rooms and was like, no, absolutely not. None of this applies to me. I don't look like you. I don't dress like you. I don't think like you. I don't need a drink to feel social. I was always so social. I was so successful. I just had this little tiny cocaine problem. And bye, you guys. I'll see you in another lifetime.
Mhm.
Also, the religious implications that felt so suffocating to me butted up against everything I learned that kept me safe as a girl, which was there is no such thing as God, and the only person you can count on is yourself. So a year went by of me just doing what addicts do, cutting and pasting and trying downers instead of uppers so I wouldn't drop dead of a heart attack maybe as quickly. And then the guy I was dating, who I had hurt terribly for years by cheating and lying and doing what addicts do, caught this prescription pill bottle in a sock drawer and looked at me with such disdain that I was still doing this at the level he was hoping I wasn't anymore. And that shame, which is external to me, took me into a meeting again because I called the same guy that I'd called a year before. Both times I went into those meetings, I wasn't at rock bottom. I was just scared
Mm.
of what I might lose that was external to me.
Oh,
And that
interesting.
second time, I stayed. I can't fully tell you why, except that I really felt like that guy, who was the only proof I had left that I was worth anything at all, was going to leave me if I didn't. So I stayed and I followed this guy, Bobby, around who had 22 years sober from heroin. I followed him around like a little puppy all over the city. And I didn't believe God. And I didn't believe in the steps. And I didn't believe I needed anything about it on a spiritual level. But I believed Bobby. I believed that this guy who overcame opening the door to the man who shot and killed his father when he was 13, who had overdosed on heroin more times than I could keep count, that if he could recover, I could recover too. I believed that. I just had no idea how. And he took me through the steps really, really quickly. And I didn't really form a power greater than myself or any kind of faith that I would be all right in the not knowing, and he would say things that sponsors say, like, you can just borrow my faith until you have some of your own. And for that year, it worked well enough. I mean, it was a miserable year because what I came to understand was no, I didn't drink and use to socialize, but God damn it, the inner critic in between my ears was so unrelenting and so mean to me that it was no wonder I anesthetized it. I mean, nothing ever was good enough. Ever, ever. I wasn't pretty enough. I wasn't smart enough. I wasn't thin enough. It was so exhausting that first year to live in deep communion with that voice in my head who had been running my life. But that's how I got through it. I really white knuckled it in the first year and was getting through grad school. And then Bobby started acting weird and I couldn't put my finger on it. And I had this chance. I was in New York to go to California to do a clinical rotation for physical therapy for 8 weeks. And I said, Bobby, I don't know what's going on with you. I'm just going to get a temporary sponsor because we were friends before you sponsored me and I don't want that to get messed up. And I remember wanting to tell him everything about California because I felt like my whole world was opening up. I always wanted to be a dancer and a singer. And there seemed to be this hope that I could practice PT and also pursue that stuff out here, which I wanted to do. And then I had a raging cocaine addiction and everything derailed. So it felt like I was hitting a reset button and I wanted to share it with Bobby. And he never picked up. And then his wife finally picked up and said, Bobby relapse. And I had no idea that that could even be a thing for a guy like him. And I remember thinking, there's got to be a misunderstanding here. So I'm just going to meet up with Bobby when I get back and everything will make sense. And then I saw him and it was like somebody went behind his eyes and just blew the light out. It was so frightening. And I describe this as being in the presence of a ghost, which unfortunately was not the first time and not the last time that this has happened to me, where you are in front of somebody whose physical body is alive, but whose spirit is dead. And he couldn't maintain eye contact and he was full of excuses and he never once said, I relapsed. I can't fucking believe it. It was just a totally different person. And I was so frightened by it. And I met up with him one more time. And then I thought to myself, I can't do this. I can't be around the one person that made me believe sobriety is possible who's not well. So I was this really unwell newcomer who had enough time after 1 year to go, well, I don't want to die, but I definitely still don't know how to live. And now this guy who was showing me the way relapsed. So it's such a fragile time for me. And then 2 weeks later, my friend in program called me and said, where are you? I need to come see you. And came to my apartment and sat down and said, Bobby's dead. I have to tell this part of my story because it's a long way to answer your question, right? Which is, how did I get to 5 years sober and then hit bottom? My overdose was not bottom. Bobby jumping out of his 8th-story window after 22 years sober was not my bottom. The overdose scared me, and my boyfriend wanting to leave me scared me into the rooms. Bobby convinced me to stay in the rooms, but I didn't really have a faith in a power greater than myself. When he died, what I knew was that if I touched drugs and alcohol, I was dead. Because if it killed him, it was coming for me. So at a year sober, what I knew was if I drink, I will die, and I don't want to die. But working those steps and believing in some kind of God is terrifying because it undoes everything I learned that kept me safe as a girl. So I'm just going to rely on pleasing and performing and perfecting because it's always worked. And so off I went. So for the next 4 years of my recovery, I just bulldozed my way through my life. And the trouble with perfectionism is that it collapses with matters of the heart. There is no amount of saying or doing just the right thing that will make somebody love you that is angry, that will bring somebody back who you've lost. And my marriage, because I was with the same guy that found those pills, that went through hell with me in my active addiction, was now my husband, started falling apart. And I relied on all those external measures. I'll just convince him to go to Al-Anon, right? The other 12-step program, so you can work the steps and forgive me and thaw out from this level of resentment that he's holding in his heart. I will say or do just the right thing to convince him to go to therapy. He's just angry. We just need to heal. I'm sure this is all going to be all right if I just X, Y, and Z. And it wasn't. It didn't matter what I said. It didn't matter what I did. And I literally was brought to the brink of insanity in sobriety, because my entire life, outside of trying to become a physical therapist and start a career and maybe try to be successful in entertainment, I was still doing all of that. But in my house, it was madness, constant fighting, and not getting any of the things I expected and had always been able to receive when I stomped my foot and shouted at the rooftops loud enough. And the fighting got so bad that I slept on a friend's couch for a weekend. And that turned into months and months and months of couch surfing in my marriage, because I had enough sobriety to know that I can't stay in that house because we're fighting all the time. And I knew that if I stayed in that state, I might relapse. And if I relapsed because Bobby was dead, I was going to die. So I had enough foresight to go, I have to get out of here, because I don't think he's going to get out if I ask him. He's the one that seems really angry. I feel like this is the least I could do, is just back away, keep my tail between my legs. And I remember after a good 6 months of couch surfing in 3 different scenarios, a sober friend was like, you can't do this. You cannot live like this. I had asked my husband one more time, could I please come home now? Makes me really sad thinking about who I was then, begging him if I could come back home when we were married. And he said, I don't think that makes sense. We're not in the right place yet. And I was flipping out to my sober girlfriend, bitching and complaining. She was like, you need to sign a lease and find a space that is yours so you can heal. Because if you're not ready to leave your marriage, you cannot live like this. When I signed that lease and I had this unfurnished apartment and I had nothing but a mattress on the floor, I remember laying on my back. It was this loft apartment in Santa Monica before the rent went crazy, and it was affordable and it was beautiful. And I just started sobbing. I felt so empty and so broken. I was 30 years old. I was 5 years sober. The one person in my life who had been with me on the front end of my addiction and saw me to the other side was now gone. So it felt like I might as well just fall through the earth and disappear. I mean, it was absolute rock bottom, because now I had evidence that relying on external things to make me okay didn't work. I finally had evidence. That's bottom.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing all of that. I can't even imagine how jarring it is for somebody to pass away like that, where I'm sure everything went through your head. Oh, so I can be sober for decades and then die of this, or what
Mhm.
does any of this actually work? And if nothing works, I'm fucked, right? I mean, I can't
Yep.
imagine the thought spirals of what's the point. So, in that moment of the rock bottom, laying on this mattress, in your apartment, what got you to say, I'm going to try? And what were the first, maybe the first step or the first couple steps that you took?
I remember in those early nights thinking to myself, how am I going to fall asleep every night? Because all I remembered was since I was young, I had these fond, sparse memories of my mom stroking my head to sleep. And then it was always pills and weed. And then it was my boyfriend, then fiance, then husband who would stroke my head to sleep. So it had never occurred to me that I would have to soothe myself to sleep ever until now. And I remember asking myself that, what are you going to do now? And then a little voice showed up and said, you're going to wrap your arms around yourself and you're just going to hold yourself, even if you're sobbing, until you go to sleep. So I did. Then I was still going to meetings. I needed them more than ever. I heard a woman share, and she had such a wild story. I mean, she had killed somebody in her using.
Wow.
And she was so far on the other side of it and happy. And I just went up to her and said, are you taking any sponsees? Called her, we started working together, and she heard everything, got caught up on where I was, and said, what if we work the steps on your marriage? I was like, I don't even know what that means, but that sounds like the best idea I've heard in a really long time. And remember, I was open and receptive now because I was despondent. But also, it just took the weight and pressure off of everything about the language that made my insides recoil, right? So if we could rewrite the language to fit the situation I was in, what might that sound like and what might I uncover? And so instead of step one being I'm powerless over alcohol, my life has become unmanageable. It was I'm powerless over my marriage. I'm powerless over how many times I cheated and lied, and that we got married rather quickly, given what we had been through without counsel. I'm powerless over my husband pulling away from me, and no thing I say or do changes his mind. I'm powerless over the outcome of this. I'm powerless over the death of all my hopes and dreams of what I thought this was all going to be right now and what it actually is. And when I try to exert power over any of those things, my life becomes unmanageable in the following ways. I'm filled with rage. I'm filled with sorrow. I'm obsessing. I'm ruminating. I'm curating the exact right thing I'm going to say when I get home to change his mind. I'm not taking care of myself at all. I have zero sense of self-worth. I don't know how to soothe, and it just went on and on like that. My real spiritual breakthrough happened in this period, in particular, when I got to step 9, which is making an amends. Because in the 5 years I'd been sober, you come into recovery, and by the time you're in recovery, you've made a lot of mistakes and you have typically hurt a lot of people, especially yourself.
Yeah.
But the amends process had always been focused externally, always. I would make a list on step 4 of everyone and everything I was resentful for, and that list became your amends list. Never once did anybody say, put yourself on your resentment list so that by the time you get to the amends list, you are number 1. So here I am 5 years sober, having lived off of my ability to self-lacerate. And this woman says, have you ever made an amends to yourself? It never even occurred to me, ever in my whole life. When I made a start of trying to understand how to arrest the inner critic and reframe a self-talk that was more compassionate, everything started to change. And now there would be so many other times after this in my sobriety where that inner critic would show up, like becoming a new mom. And it was as if I never did any of that previous work, right? And this is like, we never graduate from our spiritual curriculum.
Mm,
I can say today, 10 years from this moment of rock bottom, that I am so close with my intuitive voice. And when my critical voice shows up, I'm able to sort of right size her and honor why she's there and say, I get why you're showing up. I love you, but we're not doing this today. We're not doing this. But man, it's taken a lot of work, but I had made a start. And the thing about that, as a result of having a way to clear the shame, because a lot of what that looked like was mindfulness around how I was speaking to myself and going, oof, that's a very classic way, a perfectionist would say something in this moment. What would a more loving version of that be? I had to imagine it. And then I had to
yeah.
come up with it from inside of me. And then I had to practice saying it to myself. And also, I would meditate. And I would meditate on the vision of me as a sober woman where I was in that moment, looking back on young Samantha with the chaos of her home and overdosed Samantha trying to cover it up and cheated on her boyfriend, fiance, now husband, Samantha. And I would be able to look at her and try to forgive her for those choices. And the power of that is that when you on the inside learn that no matter what bad choice you've ever made, you're not a bad person. When you really believe that to be true, there is a shame that is lifted. And without that being lifted, I could never have started to hear the whisper of my intuition, which I now call God. So, as a result of doing that deep work, I started to hear my intuitive voice all the time. And I knew it was a different part of me because it was quiet. It always felt like it rose from the belly up. It was never cerebral. That ruminating critical voice
Yeah.
is so, it's like a ping pong game but between your ears.
Right.
It was so loving and curious and compassionate and expansive that I knew it was some other part of me that I wanted to get to know. And when the marital stuff was still in crisis and I was a doctor of physical therapy making $33 an hour, I was like, I'm not going to be okay financially. And my intuition was like, what's going on in the healthcare landscape that you might be able to improve? Because you can't work at this rate forever. And you're not fully helping people because insurance is going, you're 60, 70% better. So we're discharging you. And here I was, this dancer, this person who loved really highly dynamic three-dimensional movement. And I'm thinking, God, if I had a physical therapist who only took me to, straight leg raises when I wanted to dance again, that would be horrible. I would never get back to the thing I love. So who are these people going to when insurance says you're good? Oh, they're paying trainers, which I used to be before I was a PT, and Pilates instructors and yoga teachers 3, 4 times as much to do movement pattern correction and strength and conditioning. And I thought, what if I did that? So in this really dark time, I started a business. But at the time, it was the start of this entire journey that was birthed from a marital crisis, but also birthed from my intuitive voice. And so every time I listened to what she had to say and I took a step in the direction that she was nudging me, something really cool would happen. I'm not saying it always worked out,
Right.
but it was so much better of a path to go down than the one I had been traveling my entire life. So that was the part of my life where I reckoned with myself, my actual self.
So, was the fact that you were kind of working the steps and your marriage was the focus, did it make that easier for you because it felt more tangible to you or something? And then have you had to modify other parts of the 12-step program to make sense for you and your life? And how have you kind of implemented that, if
Yeah.
so?
Yeah. I think that it arrested the religious intonation immediately. And since that was the thing, that was the problem, it also felt really practical and applicable, as opposed to here I am in this crisis, right? Whatever your crisis is, it could be a friendship breakup, a romantic breakup, a career loss or change, a child being sick, God knows what. And all you keep talking about is I'm powerless over alcohol, I'm powerless over alcohol, I'm powerless over alcohol. And it's like, I fucking know that. I'm living a sober life. Tell me how to navigate this gross other thing and how to access real power in the wake of everything I'm powerless over about this real thing in my life, right? So it became about my emotional sobriety and not my physical sobriety, which at the end of the day is the thing you have to maintain to stay physically sober. I think those were the two things. And if I think about it now, I've been using the steps like that for 10 years in this new, fresh way. I mean, I wrote a book about it. That's how passionate I am. And it is the story of my life, but it is broken up into 12 chapters and it corresponds with all the 12 steps. And what I do is I take a step, I say it in its traditional language, and then I turn it on its head to try to cast the widest net on who I can help, because I believe, it's this best kept secret in recovery that we get access through a series of crises to the 12 steps. And then we come out, and if we can continue to use them in a way that's meaningful for whatever hard thing shows up in our life, we have this blueprint for living and having access to peace and joy, where other people, the normal person who's also struggling with fear and resentment and loss, doesn't. And I'm sitting here thinking, that's ridiculous. And it's also 2024. And the steps were written 100 years ago. And we know so much more now about addiction,
Right.
about psychology, about childhood trauma. And there is no reason why the language should stay the same and why everyone shouldn't have them in their back pocket should they want to use them. So, for example, right, if you think about step 2, it says, came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. I remember reading that and thinking, hold on a second. So, you want me, AA, 12-step program, you want me to take everything I learned and just go, dear whomever in the sky, please make me sane. Wave a wand and strike me sane because I'm acting crazy. I'm highly intellectual. Again, I had all those boxes checked.
Yeah.
I was taught not to believe in anything besides myself. So now abandon everything you've been taught about what to rely on, abandon it. And also, by the way, you're fucking crazy. So
Right.
if you believe in
Right.
this thing you can't see or touch or know that you were taught not to believe in, if you can believe in it, then you won't be crazy. It was just, so how do I repurpose that step? How do I
Right.
repurpose that step? Let's say the marital crisis. Can I come to believe that something other than my obsession to perfect and control and manage and manipulate people, places, and things, can I imagine that something else might help restore my nervous system to a feeling of safety? Is that possible? Because I know now when I'm relying on all those things I've been taught to rely on, I feel the opposite. I feel like I'm in fight or flight. I feel like I'm in constant stress and anxiety, right? Trying to ruminate and fix my marriage. And I'm fighting with him all the time, and I'm screaming, and I'm not sleeping, and I'm miserable. And that can't be the way forward in sobriety. Like, that is not joyful. That is not a way to live. So can I believe that there is another way to see this, to cope with this, to speak to myself, to love myself through this, that makes me feel safe inside? Yes, I can. I don't know what it is, but I can get down with
Right.
that. Completely
Yeah.
different experience. It's a modern and trauma informed interpretation based on science, based on the fact that my nervous system has been wired to respond to crises by fixing everything. because that's
Right.
what I had to do in my house to be safe. So what I needed to do was slowly unlearn those patterns because they were no longer keeping me safe, right? I needed to be able to have the armor drop completely in my rock bottom and then something to come in that was like a warm blanket to go, there's a way forward, even with this template, if we reimagine it.
Right. So interesting what you said. Like, the 12 steps you said were written like 100 years ago. And weren't they originally created for wealthy dudes? Right. Correct me if I'm wrong, but just like a
Correct.
group of wealthy dudes. Right. And so when you think of how many people were not in mind when these were created. And so I love the fact that you're taking this and you're making it make sense for everybody, no matter your background, no matter your status, no matter whatever. It's so important. And the fact that, like you said, step number 2 is like, all right, well, first you're insane, and now let's make you sane, right? Like, let's just, the premise is you're crazy. Do you think that we place way too much blame on the people and not enough, we don't hold the companies responsible who are selling us drugs, alcohol? They seem like they get off completely free when people are really struggling and suffering and dying, and then we say, oh, you're the problem. But what about
Mhm.
like the glorified drug dealers that are giving us this shit? I don't know, I would love to hear your perspective on that.
God, that's such an important question. And actually, I don't think anybody on a podcast so far has asked me about that. So if I respond to something just before that,
Yeah.
which is still along the lines of dispelling some of these myths around addiction, right? Gabor Mate, talks about this a lot, that addiction is the answer to a problem. And first of all, by the time you see somebody on the street who's whacked out of their mind on 1,000 drugs and homeless, and you're angry at them and you're judging them and you're just like, how could you let it get this bad, right? That it comes all the way down to them. We need to first take a step back and say, wait a second. At one time, this person was in such great suffering that the solution to their suffering was to anesthetize the pain, which makes complete sense, right? And then you wrap around the actual physical dependency and the fact that in addiction, the reward centers get very, very strong and the feedback loops for logic and reason weaken. That is the scientific fact. So that's number one, is that we're in deep trouble if we keep just going to the person and never ever seeing their pain, let alone big pharma. And that brings up just such an enormous question, problem. Here we are, you and I on this podcast, doing everything we can to come up against these corporations by being able to have a platform where we can tell the truth the way we want to, right? That's not curated to try and sell somebody something. But we live in a really toxic culture. I know we have it a lot better than a lot of people. I know I can straddle the tension of two things being true that are very, very opposite to each other. So I'm just going to slide that to the side, that compared to other places, there are many ways in which we have it better. We have the freedom to have this kind of conversation, right?
Yeah.
And still, the layers in sobriety that I'm still untangling are those very things. Wait a second. How did it get to be that I've been on this path, that I'm in so much debt, more than what I'm making, because someone told me that I needed to go right to school after high school and then right to graduate school to get the fancy degree, because that'll stabilize my life, when actually I'm in more debt than the amount of money I'm making? Who sold me that dream?
Right.
Which is now a liability. Who's selling us the drugs that are making us sick and keeping us addicted? And who's dumping the money into big pharma to keep it going? Isn't there a cure for some of this shit by now? Can somebody pull back the curtain and just tell me what the fuck is going on? And so every time I go to those spaces, when I think about the level of responsibility that is so far beyond hours. You want to talk about powerlessness. It's crazy making. If you go too far down that rabbit hole, this is the problem with social media in a lot of ways, where we have this wild access to crises. And then we go, I can't do it. I can't fucking look at it. So I'm going to do nothing. It's so disruptive to our nervous system that we just freeze. We just stop. And I think every time I go to those places, I go, well, what can I control? In my case, I wrote a book about this stuff. In my case, I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to 12-step the entire world. The rest of my life trying to shed light on the science and the soulfulness of addiction, of recovery, of what is required to truly change your life. I will speak from a raw and honest place. I will back it up with science, but I will be a person who has lived through all of it and gotten to the other side. And whatever ripple effect that has to be good enough. Because, there are some people who take measures to get into legislative action, for example, right? Who march the line and like get bills passed, and God bless those people, right? Like we need all of us need to get together in the way we feel purposeful and passionate and shout from the rooftops what is really going on. And for me, that feels like a wonderful starting point to make a change, but it's really tricky.
Absolutely. I can't do everything, but I can do something. And bringing it back to what's in your control, what's in your local community, what do you have access to do to help? And I'm a newly non-drinker, so I am like reading
Mm,
all of the information about just the brainwashing that the alcohol industry does, cigarette companies, and it's just so fascinating to me. Even the concept that we have smokers and non-smokers to describe people, even if somebody is addicted to cigarettes, right? And they're a chain smoker. Then on the other hand, we have alcoholics and kind of everybody else. It's like, why does this group have this word that maybe this other addiction doesn't? And all the layers of it, right? Of how we are kind of presented these things on a silver platter, and also how alcohol in particular is just connected to wonderful moments in our life and celebration and women's liberation and all these things. And it's like, this is
mm,
literal poison that we're voluntarily putting in our body, but they're marketing it like this little piece of candy that just makes your life better. It is really crazy when you think about it.
mm.
Was there any moments for you when you started maybe peeking behind the curtain at some of these things? Any aha moments for you, or anything that stuck out when you started doing your own digging into stuff?
Hmm. I think I'm going to go from sort of present day and then back up a little because, spending time in the trenches writing a book about all this, you unpack everything,
I bet.
and I didn't do a deep dive sort of into the cultural landscape of how much alcohol is baked into societal norms and celebrations, but I took a deep dive into my own life story and my own relationship with it all. And for me, I think really the most crippling thing was how normalized all of this was in my house. And that's the
Mm,
thing, right? Again, talk about things we can and cannot control. Like as an adult, if I'm conscious and mindful, I have a choice of what I'm putting into my body. But as a child, I don't have a choice about what I'm seeing. And
right.
what I was seeing was, not only is this what you do to celebrate, this is what you do on a good day, on a bad day, on a mediocre day. If you can't sleep, you pop a prescription pill. If you run out of prescriptions, you get somebody to get the prescription in their name and they will give it to you. I mean, so the normalcy started in my home. So when I saw it out in the world, it was like, yeah, this is what people do. This is what we do.
Interesting. Yeah.
This is what we do. I love that in the timing of writing my book, we are coming into, for everything everybody wants to say about Gen Z and the woke generation and the high sensitivity, cancel culture. You can't say, for every bad thing people want to say, the really good thing is they are questioning things like this. Whereas we have had to douse ourselves with the poison in the bullshit and hopefully hit bottom without dying, enough to come out and go, what the fuck has been happening? Whose idea is this? Whose voice is that? Because if it's not mine, where did it come from? When you come out into adulthood and you start paying attention to American culture, everything comes down to the dollar. And it is frightening that most things, even though we want to see them in their purest form at times, are reduced down to, is this profitable?
Right.
But that's how our culture operates. Can we find a way to earn a living doing what we love without hurting people, killing people, making people sick? You know, those people who are chasing the dollar in exchange for somebody's health and well-being, their soul knows that and they have to live with that. And I'm not going to carry that burden of that person. I'm just going to do my part. But thank God we're in a time where people are questioning that stuff.
Yeah.
I think it's amazing.
You mentioned that, you kind of saw certain things growing up in your home. Through
Mm.
all your research and experience and everything, do you think addiction is a learned behavior? Do you think there's genes involved? Do you think it's a
Mm.
mix of stuff? I would love to hear your perspective on that.
I definitely have addiction genetically in my bloodline. That said, lots of people do, and they don't become active addicts. As far as we know, the research has never showed that because you may have a genetic predisposition for addiction, you are going to become an addict.
Right.
What the research has showed is that all of us, every single one of us, has this whole genetic landscape. Some things that are incredible and some not so much. And then contingent on our environment and our lived experience and our trauma, big and small, some of those things can be activated. Did everything I saw in my house and my hardwired nature, because even though my mom in particular really wanted us to get a degree and was the one sort of telling me, get that prestigious certificate so no one can take it, because she had such a volatile financial and emotional life. She wanted us to be stable, but still, I was a hardwired perfectionist without that. I mean, I always felt this urgency to be absolutely perfect. Between my hardwired nature, what I saw in my house, and my genetic predisposition, there was no real shot for me not to end up in active addiction, in my opinion.
Mhm. So you mentioned that you're happily married now. Is this the same marriage that you were in that a little apartment on a mattress
Yep.
with this? Okay. How in the world did you
I know.
guys resuscitate that and get
I
to where
know.
you are? It's
I know.
unreal.
It's unreal. When my lease was up in that space that I did all that healing, him and I had been in therapy with a new person, and it seemed to be going well. And obviously I was doing so much better because I was doing the work I really had needed to do my whole life. And we were like, I think this is gonna work. Like I basically I moved back in. As soon as I moved back in, I could see everything clearly. He was still diverting his eyes from me, making up excuses, going on business trips. And I was just like, this isn't about me anymore. That's the thing about shame and clearing shame is you stop looking at things through the past and what they used to be, or through the future and what you wish they would just become. You actually get to see things squarely for how they are in real time. And I looked at him and said, I don't want to do this with you. I don't deserve this mediocre marriage where you're not showing up. And my intuition said, don't worry, you'll find out everything you need to know, whether you stay or go. Doesn't matter. And I had just moved back in right out, and I was like, not moving out right now. So it was like another couple weeks. And then he went on one more trip. I knew it was a big, huge web of lies. It was so obvious. And I just went, have a good time, just really detached. And the day after he got home, the girl who he had been seeing on and off, sent me a very long email with every photo of them, every hotel receipt,
My gosh.
every concert ticket that they had ever gone to. And what I had come to find out is that when I had cheated on him early on for the zillionth time, he was out in Vegas and cheated on me with her. There are some people that especially in this untreated enabler role, I was the untreated addict, he was the untreated enabler. Everyone's sick in that equation, by the way, right? Just a different type of sickness. So in his case, he was accumulating a ton of resentment, but didn't have the courage or the self-worth to say, I deserve better, I'm leaving you. And so he was cheating to kind of exit the relationship. It kind of gave him a launching pad to go, okay, I'm out. I found somebody new, right? That was his own codependency. Shortly after that cheating, that one episode, I got sober. He was like, fuck, right? Because he didn't see that coming. So he kind of said to her, I got to see where this is going with Sam. And so, of course, I don't know any of this, right? So we get engaged. We move to California. We get married, and he's got guilt from what happened. And I'm this stompy, demanding newcomer who has no real program, right? So I'm not super pleasant. And I don't blame myself, by the way. Like, that is not to be self-deprecating, but this is just like the reality of the dynamic, right? And so he made a really, really bad decision, called her again, opened that door. He was in finance at the time. And so he did have to travel a lot for business. So what started as I got to go here for a business conference became like, wow, you're traveling a lot. And also you're leaving your ring at home. Why? And really just in your face, like, are you cheating on me? So every time he'd come home, it was this chaos and fighting and me just screaming, like, tell me the fucking truth. I know you're cheating on me. I don't know what to tell you, Sam. Like, you're the one that cheated. I don't know what to tell you. So I was being gaslit, right? And every time he tried to end it with her, at that point, having reopened the door, she was like, go ahead and end it. Sam's information is all over the internet. I'm just going to contact her and tell her. So if you want to fuck it up with me, I'm going to fuck it up for you. So he was like living a double life, which is why he couldn't look me in the eye. It was what, he just was riddled with guilt. And now when I came back home, I could see that it was all on him now, because I was no longer the reason why he could say or do any of those things. So of course, when I found everything out, I mean, it was like a Lifetime movie. You know what I mean? I went home and I threw a shit on the sidewalk, literally. And then I stayed at that house after having moved a zillion times for 2 weeks. And I was like, you know what? This guy kept coming around. He kept coming around, memorializing our life. He wasn't respecting my boundaries. And I thought, Samantha, you've moved so many times. You could stay here in this very expensive 3-bedroom house that you don't need, riddled with toxic memories, with this guy coming around and not leaving you alone. Or you could do what you know how to do, which is move, just move again. The brilliant thing about this time is that I kept that space that I healed in, because I rented the apartment in a commercial residential mixed use building. And before I left, my intuition said, why don't you find out if you can keep this and use it as your new business spot instead of going to clients' homes? So I did. And I converted it to a fitness studio. So when I moved out of the house, I said, you know what? I'm out. I got an apartment again. I signed a year-long lease. I filed separation papers and was preparing for divorce. I fucked every human being in sight. And I had my business space, Yeah. And I trudged along with this fear, obviously, of like, what is my life now without this man? And with a renewed sense of hope and excitement because of the work I had done on myself of like, you're going to be okay. One of my greatest fears was like, I was getting all that baby fever in my early 30s and I was so sure he was going to be the guy. And now, oh, fuck, right? Like, and I really had to meditate on the vision of me holding my baby and the mantra of, your perfect baby is coming. You just don't know when or how or with who. If you want to be a mother, you need to trust that you are going to be a mother. You just don't know when or how or with who. And About 8 months into that year-long lease, my intuition was like, if there is any part of you that feels like there is a happy life on the other side of this big mess, that in the arc of your story, you were two like very young, very reckless kids who really loved each other, who made just really horrible choices, like the choices you made when you were an active addict and now you're this sober woman with dignity and grace. Like maybe that's true for him too. If it is true, if you think there is a way forward, you might have to stay. And the only way I can share this part is that every time I would meditate about that, the visual that came to me was always a visual. It wasn't a yes or no. It was me looking through a dark tunnel, an endless dark tunnel that at the very, very end on the other side had a tiny little match lit. And I couldn't understand that as anything other than there is a little bit of hope here that something good might be on the other side of this. And so we started dating again. And all the paperwork that I had all ready to go just got ripped up. And the process of thawing out from that level of betrayal by a person I loved that deeply was excruciating. When I was intimate with him, I just couldn't enjoy it. I could not let myself be vulnerable enough to feel pleasure from this man. And all of my trauma from all the physical rejection, there was so much, it all showed up there. And I remember talking to my therapist about it because I said, maybe this is it. You know, I fucking tried. I love this man. I've like forgiven him, but my body hasn't forgiven him. And maybe this part, we can't get it back, which would make sense that we can't get it back. You know, maybe this is where it ends. And she said, maybe, is there anything he could say or do or show you to make you feel loved and wanted and that you can trust him and that he's a great husband? Is there anything else? Because if there is, you should tell him and give him a chance to show up. And the answer was no. I mean, that's how all in he was when we got back together. If the story of our lives were this analogy, early young Sam was a wild animal who could not be tamed. She was with Rob, but she fucked anybody she wanted. She fucking did as she pleased. She caused a bunch of wreckage. She got sober and she got put in a cage and it was locked and the tail was between her legs. I need to stop everything about who I used to be and be a good girl. So I don't deserve the sex. I don't deserve the love. I don't deserve the affection. I don't deserve. This is what I get for what I did as a wild animal. Okay. I find out he cheats on me. I fucking thrash out of the cage and I go wild again. This time, much more liberated because I'm sober. I'm mindfully being wild and untamed. We get back together. I forgive him. I go back in the cage. I realize nobody locked the door and I need to walk out of the cage. And so what I did is I've decided that every time I'm intimate with him, if there is even a second where I start to get in my head about anything, maybe not even the past. I'm a mom now. We have 2 kids. Could be just whatever. I am going to honor the call of my body moment to moment. If I don't like making out, I'm not going to stay there and do it. I'm going to do whatever I want to do every single second I want to do it so that I am in my body, I am in the moment, and I am enjoying. I am going to let that wild animal out in a safe way and be wild with him. We have been together for 21 years.
I was just going to ask you. And how long ago was that when you decided, let's do this again? We're both in a different place. There's been sobriety and some healing and stuff like that.
We are about 11 years on the other side of the affair, and we have a big, beautiful life.
It's so interesting because when we hear about the messaging around kind of being in a toxic relationship or an unhealthy relationship is get out of it and go be with somebody else and then you can be healthy with them. But it's very interesting to be in an unhealthy relationship with somebody and then the new healthy relationship is with the same person. Got to be a lot of sometimes maybe conflicting feelings, but it is almost like being with a new person though. So I'm curious about what you might share about that kind of experience.
Anybody who is with somebody in their 20s and even makes it to 30, the whole relationship's going to change. In our case, you add on top of that the dysfunction of addiction and enablement, the power dynamic, if you will, right? The dynamic period was so sick and unhealthy. And as soon as I got sober, it switched, but it went from I'm the one that felt like I had all the power. And then I come out from under my wreckage and feel so much shame. Well, he's in charge now. Like, so that's not healthy either. We're definitely spoon fed with a toxic positivity, right? Of like, if it's not serving you, leave. And it's like, well, maybe that might be true, but also what is true for any long-term relationship is that two people are going to be in certain places and then they will keep growing and changing, or one will keep growing and changing and the other will not. Something's going to happen. They're going to reach a crossroads where the new dynamic creates a scenario where there's some sort of rupture. And either those two people are both going to go, I want to repair this rupture and let it scar down and make our relationship stronger so we go forward again from here, or they're not. So I think the truer thing is that the long-term complicated relationships of our lives are always in ebb and flow and will ultimately come down to not being in the same place as your partner at all times, but in fact, when you're in different places and you guys hit a bump in the road, are both people still willing to see it through?
Do you ever find yourself slipping back into the old relationship patterns or habits, or has there been a kind of a clear, definitive line between the old versions of yourselves and the new versions, and it's been pretty simple not to dip back into those old things?
I mean, the old days of, when I was in my active addiction, they're long gone. But
Yeah.
behaviorally, can I go back into that place of edginess, sharpness, where there's a little tiff on my shoulder? Yes. And also the way he comes at that when he's not at his best is kind of the old version of him that enabled and sort of loved me to a fault is like gone. And sometimes I actually really miss that side of him because I'm like, you used to be so sensitive. And now, like, when he's defensive, the opposite happens. It's like a whatever. Yeah, whatever. I'm not doing this right now. Like, it's like a dismissive defensiveness. So that's what will happen to us now when we're kind of getting at it. I'll be sharp and short and maybe a little demanding, and he'll just go, yeah, no, I'm not doing this right now. We'll feel icky about it. And then we very quickly now can come back and I can say something like, I'm really sorry. I'm feeling nervous about the launch of my book and this thing I'm planning, and I feel kind of out of control. And I was expecting like certain things to be taken care of. And when they weren't, it sort of exacerbated my fears and I took it out on you. At, at which point he will say, thank you for saying that. I get it. And, I love you. And I didn't mean to be dismissive. I sometimes have a hard time, understanding the emotional bandwidth that you carry with you all the time. Sometimes it's easier for me to just push it away. There's always stuff, but it's never like as bad as it was in the beginning. And we've also really learned how to put the sword down. I mean, the way we used to nitpick and fight, there's so much more of just, let's not do this.
Right.
Like almost immediately, because we can see where it would go and we know where it's coming from and it's not our highest self. And we're just like, yeah, no, we're not going to give that energy.
Yeah. I really appreciate how honest you've been. Like,
Mhm.
really, really honest. It's very refreshing.
Such a good talk.
Thanks for being here so much, Samantha. I really appreciate it. Where can people find you, your book, all that good stuff?
My website is drsamanthahart.com. That's also my social media handles.
Thank you so much for the chat.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so go check out Dr. Hart's resources. And then I just wanted to give a quick shout out to one of our former guests who was part of our subscriber series, Kia. Kia mentioned a book on her episode called Quit Like a Woman: The Radical Choice to Not Drink in a Culture Obsessed with Alcohol, written by Holly Whitaker. And I ended up listening to the audiobook. It was fascinating. I've shared a little bit on the podcast through the years about how I have experimented with being a non-drinker. I'd go a year or year and a half without drinking, then I'd come back to it. I'll go 6 months here without it, 3 months here, whatever. It's kind of just been a back and forth for me for a while. And it's something I've deep down wanted to remove from my life for quite some time. But I felt this pull to kind of keep it around for social reasons, honestly, because I feel like I already don't always fit in a social setting in a lot of ways because of my other lifestyle choices, being vegan, not having children, not wanting children, being minimalistic with my stuff, my belongings, pursuing entrepreneurship, all these things. I feel like I'm already kind of the weirdo at a party, if you will. And I've been keeping alcohol around to have some kind of common denominator with other people, especially if I'm meeting new people for the first time. And I just don't want to do it anymore. I can't do it anymore. It's not authentic to myself. I try to take care of my body and stuff in other ways. It does. So having alcohol part of my life is just not lining up. And I feel so much better when I don't drink. And the last few years, especially, I've gotten very into, other drinks like tea and mocktails, different sparkling waters, things like that. And I just enjoy so many things outside of alcohol that it's made it very simple not to drink. And yeah, the older I get, I just notice that when I have drank recently, it's just I maybe get a little bit of a buzz for 15, 20 minutes, and then I start to feel like crap. So it's just not something I'm going to do anymore. And I've been kind of keeping it to myself for a little bit. And look, I mean, I started drinking at 15. So I've had 20 years with it, all of the types of experiences you can imagine. I'm good to go. Like I'm good to close that chapter. So anyway, I wanted to thank Kia for mentioning that book on her episode because it truly put the nail in the coffin for my drinking days. It's just all the information in there was exactly what I needed to hear for myself to kind of give myself permission to let this thing go that is normalized in our society. And I also wanted to share this because I didn't have a big, rock bottom moment. There was nothing that happened around getting really sick from it or, doing something I regret or anything. It was just, I don't need it anymore. I don't want it anymore. So I know we've touched a little bit on the podcast through the years about sobriety and being sober curious and all that stuff, and that you do not have to hit one of those moments or a rock bottom to stop drinking or doing a drug or whatever it is that might be in your life that is just simply not adding value to your life. It's kind of taking more than it's giving. And I think, Holly in her book gives you some questions to ask kind of around that as well, which was very helpful. So anyway, thank you, Kia, for recommending that book. Again, it's called Quit Like a Woman, The Radical Choice to Not Drink in a Culture Obsessed with Alcohol. If you are somebody who really enjoys questioning their conditioning around things, you will really love this book. And by the way, this book is not like sponsoring the episode or anything. I'm just sharing it because I found it to be a helpful tool. And I also just wanted to take a moment to share how you all add so much to my life with your recommendations and favorite books and stories and experience. I received so many kind messages from you about how the podcast has helped you in some ways. And I feel the exact same way about all of you. So thank you. And I will talk to you soon. Thank you for tuning in to Self-Helpless. You can find our brand new merch, Patreon community, and other fun goodies at selfhelplesspodcast.com. We'd be thrilled if you left an Apple Podcast review, shared this episode with a friend, or post about it on Instagram and tag us at Self-Helpless Podcast so we could repost you and say hi. As an independently produced show, we sincerely appreciate your support. Thanks, everybody.